Welcome to another episode of Conversations with the Co-op. I'm Jeff Lee, the K-12 Special Education Coordinator for the Paul Bunyan Education Cooperative. Today I'm sitting down with Eric Storbakken, one of the Co-op's occupational therapists. How are you doing today?
Good.
Good.
Thank you for asking.
Thanks for joining me today. I know there's a lot of questions that people have kind of surrounding occupational therapy, OT as we like to abbreviate it. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe enlighten us a little bit about what occupational therapy is and maybe a little bit about the differences between clinical and educational OT.
And that is such an evolution of understanding with occupational therapy. We are inherently a complex and inclusive profession, that it's really one answer. You'll get numerous answers from, and just a variation oftentimes from many occupational therapists. But in my best understanding and how I approach my position with Paul Bunyan Education Cooperative is that a student, if we really focus on a student and really kind of have that elementary student in mind for the kind of this explanation for right now, it's their occupation. And their occupation is largely performing as a student. And there are variations in that they're going to be eating, they're going to be playing in the playground, they're going to gym. So all those are the parts of their current occupation. And every once in a while we'll get involved with giving parent ideas in that home setting so that they can perform better in that school setting, which may involve some of the sleep, or they're holding it together and they fall apart at home, or everything's going well at home but it's not going well at school, and why can't it go as well at school as it does at home? So just that whole, if you really focus on the term occupation and now apply that to the student and all the kind of the job responsibilities, the learning opportunities that they have to do during the day, that's kind of the crux of occupational therapy. So as we look at throughout their day, and that's kind of that gift of OT, is that we can look at those interferences within that school setting and find out what isn't going well, how we can make that go better. What I look forward to and why I like my job so well is that collaborating with people, and we call them stakeholders, but people within that school setting that are most involved in that student, and how can we make that student more independent with their skills so they can do more of it on their own without as much extra accommodations that the teacher has to make. So more that they can do on their own and feel good about it.
When we think of like a clinical OT, we would probably think of occupations that are, how do I do my regular job, or maybe even how do I do tasks that I would typically do around my house. Does that sound correct?
Yes.
And so kind of there's some comparison between the two of them. But then when we're really looking at that educational side of it, we're focused more on how to be that student and how to do that. So being able to do the dishes at home isn't necessarily the same thing as being able to write a paper kind of thing. Is that kind of where those differ between a parent comes in and says, my doctor says my kid needs OT services, can we put it on the IEP?
Yes, and I think a really good example, and it's one that I fall back on. So in my previous life in Duluth, I was a outpatient neurorehabilitation occupational therapist in occupational therapy. And I had two 14-year-olds that I was working with specifically. And they were not at school. They had significant head injuries. And what we were doing was simulating what their school day would look like. So instead of embedding, we were doing math, algebra. We were kind of simulating it, and we were trying to increase their tolerance for that activity. But it was filtered. It was controlled. I could control the whole environment, so there were no peer interruptions. And of course, this is all pre-cell phone, so there were no cell phone interruptions or anything else that would cause. But I could control that whole environment. I could stage it, so I was in complete control. I could alter the lighting. I could alter the sounds. I could alter the sensory stimulation. I could make it highly successful for that student within my setting. Hard part is we don't operate in that setting. I don't do my job in an isolated setting. But oftentimes there's so many other factors that make it easier to succeed in that clinic, but it becomes helpful for a burst of services and like a strengthening activity or a skill set, or that they really can't operate in that school setting and they have to develop the skills first in isolation and for a long period of time, that it it can work together. And then I'm there for the long haul. I'm there with helping with the accommodations, helping to streamline those clinical services within the school. What really went well?
Sounds very similar to when we look at other skills training that we do with students, right? We bring a student in for, let's say, behavior social skills, and we have them in our controlled environment of our classroom, and we role play some things, and we get that really in that controlled setting, and then we want to progress into them being in the classroom and demonstrating those same skills. It sounds like you're saying the clinical side is more of that controlled environment, that we can have more of the factors lined up the way we need them to learn and be able to adapt, so that when they come into the educational setting, then they can do that, because it's a lot less structured in there in those regards.
Very much. And I think one thing that could really go well is the reverse, like that clinical side saying, hey, what isn't going well in that school setting? Mm-hmm. And that doesn't have to be an OT sharing that. It could be a teacher, a parent sharing that. What isn't really going well, and what could we work on in that clinical setting with intensity? Mm-hmm. And you have that moment of ramping up, making it a little bit difficult, phasing down, keeping them well regulated through that whole time. But you can really practice that skill. But then that back communication is, this is really going well. Let's do a trial. Now we have that peer group. Now we have that classroom. Now we have those distractions. Now we have multiple non-preferreds that are being asked of the student during the day. And how do they handle being told to stop a preferred and do a non-preferred? And that's where we start to see. And we'll talk a little bit about that and how it interacts with some of the behavior and sensory type needs that we see in our schools.
I know when I was going through my education to be a special ed teacher, we really didn't touch very much on some of these services like OT, PT, and those. Coming in my first year, and actually several years after, I didn't really understand when and how to get OT involved. I'm just kind of wondering if there's any advice that you have, kind of thinking of case managers, understand the difference between clinical and educational OT and how that can really help support the kid.
I think the best way to start handling that is working with your OT in bursts and just creating that relationship. My personal goal every year is to meet weekly with case managers. And sometimes it depends on how many, or if you even have students that I work with, but really work with us and help us show you some of that distinguishing differences. Because I think it's through examples that best can make that different between that clinical and education understanding. But truly, I am there as a related service. And I think that related service piece is I'm going to prop you up to make you the rock star, to make you the one that delivers the bulk of those services for that student and getting that independence and that skill acquisition. So I'm going to be there to give you the skills. So if we can have that dedicated time to really work together, is certainly very important.
I really like that concept of collaboration and really getting those students to be in the classroom, practicing those skills, working with those skills, and having all the staff that are kind of involved understanding what that student's goal is and that how they're achieving that with that. So Eric, what are some behaviors or indicators that a case manager or maybe the classroom teacher might notice that would maybe suggest that a student could benefit from occupational therapy screening or maybe needs to be added to an assessment?
We're really going to be looking at what are those skills that child, that student is unable to do in their classroom with their peers or in their resource classroom that is so much more, takes more intervention, so much more, and it's a struggle, and you're just not finding that right skill set, maybe the right wording, the right adaptation, and we can come in with our ability to look at what's not going well, and we'll use that term task analysis. So we'll really be watching for what's interfering with that student's performance. But truly, some of the academic concerns, really filtering out what is academic and what might be something else. And I thought the best way to handle that would be to just read off some areas so we're all on that same page. So if I sound a little methodical, it's just so that we're clear and on that same page to what we're going to try and promote in the future.
Yeah.
So this is what you could possibly be seeing. So here are some questions that you could be asking yourself of how and when to possibly bring in an OT. So can the student access and effectively demonstrate the fine motor skills needed to use the materials and supplies needed to participate in class? So we're going to look at cutting in that kindergarten, first grade. But if they're not doing a lot of cutting in the classroom and they're okay with just doing some route cutting, maybe that's not as important of a skill. But it's something that we can tweak with positioning, like even stuffing. Sometimes we'll like thumbs up and we'll put Kleenexes under their elbows to keep their elbows from being up in the air. So we'll look at what's interfering and what's tweaking.
Can I interject one more thing before you kind of go into that list? Because I think one other thing to keep in mind as you're going through this is how discrepant do they look from their peers with it, right? I don't expect a ton of kindergartners to be cutting super straight lines, but as the other students are progressing and we're seeing improvement, if this student isn't improving and is really still struggling, is something different than their peers that we need to maybe get some specialist involved in it.
Well stated, Jeff. I think that evolution, we go back to our first conversation, and Jeff and I have spent a lot of time, and he's asked many good poignant questions of how does it look? When do I bring this? It's been this really work, and he's wanted to learn. And that's that key piece of when we're really working with those teachers to help modify those students, that understanding of what we do isn't going to just be a descriptor on a piece of paper. It's going to be showing you and explaining. And yes, I have a question. Can you please clarify that? And so that was really well stated, Jeff. Nice job.
Thank you.
So some other areas, one that we used to be before regulation became such a big concern and coming in ready to learn was pencil grip. And that pencil grip is that huge evolution of, you can hold a pencil many ways. Or my most go-to scenario for working with parents is we can all run a track race. It's just maybe different, and our time might be different, but we most likely will finish. So just how much work are we willing to put into our pencil grip? And we're really looking for that efficiency. And so any of these skills that Jeff and I have been talking about within the classroom, sometimes it's an efficiency thing. Can we make it a little bit better, a little bit easier? And sometimes we can. Sometimes those habits are really well embedded that we're not going to make that change. Even that how they're forming some of their letters may just be inefficient, but we're not going to change it because it's a well-learned motor pattern, and it's not going to be done differently unless there are thousands of attempts that are done that right way. So we're just going to be looking of some of our best writers may have a fisted grip. They're working really hard, but what they're putting on paper is very legible. And we can also have some very efficient people hold pencils, and it could be very sloppy. And so what is that disconnect? What is not going well? And we can be an insight. And again, always with that parent permission.
Well, and thinking like that pencil grip, if the student who uses his fist to write and isn't bothered by it and is putting out appropriate tasks with that, I mean, that's a very different thing than the kid who is doing that fist grip and is complaining that this is too hard, I can't do this, and then not completing those tasks, not able to actually, meet those writing standards because it's exhausting and taking too long and frustrating for him.
Yeah, perfectly stated, Jeff. Well done. And then we're going to be looking at, some of the visual motor coordination for tasks like coloring, drawing, and legible handwriting. Can they access and efficiently use technology devices in the classroom? For a long time, it was like a mouse. We always had a mouse. Now we have a trackpad. Can they operate that? Can they scroll on their screen? Can they operate that clicker? And yes, there's going to be that entry-level learning experience, but with numerous attempts and presentations of that skill, that child is not getting that. So what could be some interferences with that?
And I know you and I have had those conversations about, is using the home row to do proper keyboarding, is that the appropriate, if I get really stuck on that and they're not typing the right way, right, that really bothers some people. But at the same time, are these students, again, putting out appropriate work and not being bothered by it? I know, not getting stuck in our old paradigms of how technology was when we were learning it, and looking at where are we currently at with that technology and can that student navigate it?
Absolutely. And really getting back to that same thing with that pencil grip, that efficiency. If they're only able to get out a certain amount with their thumbs only, what are ways that we can help support that? Should we be taking a little bit of time and teaching them some home row basics so they can use more of their fingers rather than just two isolated fingers or the right index or left index only finger to do their typing? Could we get them a little bit faster? Is it something that parents would be willing to work at in a game setting at home? There are a lot of free typing programs that can be fun, and if that right parent is willing to invest in that, we really can get that child somewhere. Or could we do their spelling words that are typing? And certainly we know that voice output is an option, and it can be a useful tool for some of our kids, but I think in the beginning we really want to go through that fruition of doing the skill that is most commonly used, and where are they going to go, and as we have to accommodate, we certainly can. But we'll be looking at also using, what is their alertness level, their attention, and their self-regulation. What is, and I know this is going to come up a little bit, hopefully we'll have time for it, but just that sensory. We're going to be looking at what are interferences into getting to that just right mode for learning. Is it more than the whole peer group? If that class is a roar and they're huddled in the corner, well, that's a problem. If they're also part of the roar, why are they being singled out? Maybe it's just part of that. So we'll help filter that. We'll help you navigate through that. Can they manage their personal materials? Can they find things in their backpack? That is a skill, not often seen, but sometimes kids can't find their things in their backpack. Maybe it takes more organization. How can they get on their clothes, their outerwear, especially in the wintertime? Sometimes those zippers that are not very high quality are difficult for our kids. So is it really an independence thing, or is it a quality thing? Certainly going to the bathroom, we don't want to see our kids coming out with their pants halfway down and they can't pull them up. What are ways that we can quickly make that better? That would be much more than 1 or 5 times of a teacher helping to support that. Maintaining organization of their desk, locker, and personal spaces. We certainly can be a help with that, but when largely the classroom is disorganized, it may not be that much different. But if it's truly hurting them from getting started and they're constantly trying to find things and they're late getting their assignment and they can never get it done, again, it has to be what's interfering with getting their job done.
Case managers might work on some of those executive functioning skills, those organizational skills. And when we're monitoring that and we're not seeing that progress, then it might be time to say, hey, let's talk to our OT and show them this is what we've been working on. This is kind of the progress that we have made. Is this something that you could be a part of or help us with or give some suggestions? And if we can't move forward with that, then we might need to look at, do we need to do some sort of assessment or screening on this?
Correct. We're going to look at the cafeteria, their lunchroom, what's going well. Certainly there are many kids that need milk open, their apple slices open. Sometimes they can open from the same company. It can be a different seal on that container, that plastic container that's harder to open. Certainly those foil with the juice, But it's so much harder. They're never getting to, they're not even attempting to try. Is it so defeating that they're not? When has it become that next critical step that we pull in that professional? We're going to look at seating. How are they sitting in the classroom? Do they need more alertness, less alertness? Do they need more? Are their feet touching the ground? We're going to be looking at that. Are their elbows up to their nose so they can't write very long? So we're going to be looking at how that posture and what's that ultimate position for them to complete longer assignments, to sustain that grip, and they may not be able to do it in their present level. Certainly glare, what we've noticed is bright overhead lights, even with our new dimmables and a white surface and a white paper. That's a lot of glare. So we're going to maybe see some kids struggle with how long they can look at paper and have some fatigue. See how they transition. Lots of kids struggle with transition. That's not a new concept, but the more that you can practice that, especially in those K1, 2 grades, that transition of how do we dysregulate, how do we re-regulate that, and really embedding it within your school day, that can be helpful. The more that you can do, it becomes more effective. But when that isn't going well, then yes, pull us in. See how we can help make that smoother, better. Sometimes we won't have an answer. And sometimes our recommendation may just be too much for you to absorb into your classroom. And that's okay. That does happen. Interactions with peers. How are they, that friendship? Sometimes we do help with some of those social stories, not often. We seem to have enough experts and skilled teachers within that role that are really helping with that. Speech has taken on some of those social skills, so we're really supportive of that. And many of our groups and our skilled population with mental health have been supportive in that school environment.
I love this list. This is really helpful, I think. One thing that it does make me think about is some of our older students who can advocate for themselves. It seems like an appropriate question for them might be, what do you want to do or would you like to do that your peers are already doing? And that might be a good indicator then, too, of a time to get you involved or an OT involved.
And certainly we've spent enough time in that elementary setting, but as we get, one thing that could be stronger in our schools would be that transition. I think we're a little underutilized as they're starting to leave our school. And what does it look like? So that question is really spot on there, Jeff, of how we could come back in and help support some of those accommodations. What are some of those skills? And do you have the right resources in place to make this a realistic goal? Or do we need to really start having hard conversations that this might be really hard for you, and what are some backup options? And we can help support some of those conversations.
Eric, I know as an occupational therapist, you hear a lot about sensory needs and people come to you asking about that. I think there's a little bit of confusion sometimes, and I'm wondering if you can help us distinguish between a sensory need and other behaviors that might be mistaken for a sensory need.
Heading back, just taking one step back from sensory, I think really what we're looking at is regulation. And what is that just right, I'm ready to learn mode that we can get our student into? And what components of that just right mode are interfering? And so when sensory is certainly a component, and I touched briefly on that, that light, that visual stimulation, if there's a lot of activity within that classroom and they just can't get started, sensory is that factor, that visual sense specifically. Often that dysregulation could be into that behavioral, but there may be sensory components with that. So maybe we're working really closely with that emotional behavioral teacher and the classroom teacher to help filter out what is behavior, what are sensory, what are triggers, and really getting back to maybe not so much that over global sensory, but what are those things that just are too much for that child to operate within that classroom efficiently. And really getting back to practice those skills in that resource classroom. But often it's not in isolation that it's just a sensory. Sometimes we see or hear the comment of, well, if I rub their back, they really relax well. And human touch cannot be underscored. And sometimes a replacement of a compression vest or a weighted vest is not sufficient. It's not going to replace. So just because they respond well to that connection to a human touch of someone that they really trust, and it's a positive and it's a reassuring mode, doesn't mean that's a sensory need. It means in that moment they need that connection with someone to help them get through that day. Now, if they're curling into you or they're under their table, they're pushing on the wall, if some of those things that are habitual that we're starting to see, then maybe an accommodation or a tool could be useful. And we may start out with just a weighted lap pad. How does that work? How do they respond with that weight? Sometimes weight, just because it goes well for one student, doesn't mean it's going to go well for another student. And we get really concerned with some of those accommodations that teachers have seen go well, and they just think, oh, I'll try it with this next student. I think that worst case scenario was a weighted vest had been tried and had gone well with my support with one student. A teacher thought, hey, this student looks similar. I'm going to put this on this student, and sent him off to the lunchroom. It was too much for him. He walked down to the lunchroom and promptly bonked another kid in the head. It is too much, and you have to be aware of that. Some of these tools don't maybe seem like much to us, but for the child in that moment, it may be too much. So we really help gauge and walk through, and we're a little bit more prescriptive in our recommendations when we get to some of those larger sensory tools like vibration and weight. A compression vest will look at those moments that they're most dysregulated, and maybe it can help them through that moment. But just because it does well for 30 minutes doesn't mean it's going to help through the whole day, because it'll lose some of that effectiveness. So really, it's a walk that we need to do with you And some are accommodations that we can make, some are accommodations that we can't make. We can't have everyone sitting in a hammock outside on a beautiful day. It may not go well. We have to find that just right, practice it.
It seems to me like an antecedent behavior consequence type of observation, kind of doing that systematically might be beneficial here, right? Is the behavior in response to what you might consider a typical stimuli, right? I'm nervous, so I'm going to start pacing. That isn't necessarily abnormal. Or when you were talking about like the pushing against things and things like that, like are we seeing a student doing that in maybe what we might consider atypical situations? And then that might say we need to explore that a little bit more, as opposed to, like you said, a student who wants to get a hug, right? That doesn't mean they have a sensory need, that they want some connection. But do we see some connection between what happened previously to the behavior or to the consequence that's happening? Is that kind of true? Do you guys do similar things like that when you're coming in and doing an observation or anything?
Very much, Jeff. I think that explains it, summarizes it very nicely. And this is just a thumbnail. And we all have previous experiences as OTs that can bring a little bit different flavor. So we're going to come in with different tools, different mindsets of what we're observing. So just what I'm sharing doesn't mean that's the only way. It's just one, it's my flavor on it. But we certainly have well-skilled people that have been working closely with us a number of years, or someone like Jeff who's really taken that time to want to understand and can start to help see and support. So you certainly don't always have to go to an OT to help understand it. There are resources within the district and the co-op that'll help you know that just right and when we should be pulled in. But really, before the ball gets too far down that assessment or that trialing of some, do a pause. Always ask early on if you can. We will fit it in. And as long as we have that parent permission, we can single out just a little bit and do a trial. But as long as we're walking with that parent and you're willing to try it, we will help support you.
Well, and I think that's a really important thing, talking about getting those parents' permission, that involvement, understanding it. When you're talking about the example of, well, this magical weighted vest helped this kid, so let's just apply it here, without that consultation, without that rationale. I mean, we think of sensory diets and they need different things. And I'm a special ed teacher. I'm not an occupational therapist. I haven't had the training in that. And so having that consultation with you or any OT about what should happen, but in making sure that parent is also involved in that so that they're aware. Maybe they are receiving that clinical OT outside and they haven't let us know that yet. Like, we need to have that open communication between everybody and have that real collaborative model.
And I think that key really, you bring up a good point, Jeff, and it alludes to interpretation. Don't underscore. Many people can report results of a questionnaire, and I think of our school psychs, and they report results and they'll ask sensory type. But the key difference is they're reporting it, we interpret it. We have that skill set. We're going to continuing education. We're professionally bound to be evolving in our skill set and what are new tools out there and how can they help our kids. But we're going to help interpret what we're seeing, what you're seeing, give it to you in an explanation that you can understand or re-explain it so that then you can go on to that parent. And if it just is not working, we can certainly be that resource with you to help explain it to that parent. But the worst case scenario is a child comes home and said, so-and-so put this on to me today and it was horrible. Now that parent is concerned, as they should be. You would want to know what's happening to your child. We want to offer that same courtesy to our families as well. Whether they're very involved or really under-involved, it doesn't matter. They need some way of knowing what before we start trialing things. And
just real quick, adding this on here, that the equipment that you guys use in your profession and with your discretion and stuff, has specific purposes to it and isn't just something that I could walk into a room and say, hey, here's this barrel swing. I'm just going to let the kids swing on this, right? Like that's specialized equipment with a specific purpose for it. And I think we need to keep that in mind. If that's something we think would benefit our student, then we should be talking to our OT about this is why, or this is what I'm seeing, and get their professional opinions on those. And that's a whole evolution topic, is that sensory room. And
how that sensory diet, and I really go back to that interpretation piece. We are observing through skilled eyes how they're responding to that sensory experience. And so often kids go into that spinning mode, and it is such a powerful, it's so underutilized. Yes, a child with a pretty well-developed sensory system may go onto the playground and sit on that spinner and walk a little bit dizzily, but they can pull that body just right. Those kids of ours that may not respond that same way, or may have emotional experiences, and the sensory room is being used for a whole different way to get out lots of anger and stuff like that. That is a whole other skill set that even I as an OT don't possess. And to get that emotional training to use the sensory room is something that I would have to go and take continuing ed. It is actually a specialty within the occupational therapy field. So don't underutilize. And we've put only a few tools into our sensory room. In that clinic mode, there are, in a well-developed sensory room, we really invest that 45 minutes into how we flare kids up and how we bring them back down. And I will do that in a condensed version in the school with the tools I have available, but I'm not going to get to that deep sensory, and especially that vestibular, the proprioception, those real complex terms that people don't have that understanding about. I have some of that understanding, and I will help navigate that, but you just cannot take a child down, have them go all out in the sensory room, and expect them to come back regulated and well prepared to learn. That is something that needs to be done in consultation with your building occupational therapist.
Eric, thank you so much for talking with me today. Your expertise in this is just phenomenal, and I know when we set this up, you had talked about, when I talk to you, I'm getting the Eric Storbakken version of things. I know that there are other occupational therapists out there that might have some different opinions and stuff, and I think that that's just important to kind of note. But we really appreciate everything. Your experience and your knowledge has been wonderful. Thank you for coming today.
You're welcome. Thanks, Jeff.
Join us next time when we talk about another wonderful issue or trend in special education. This has been Conversations with a Co-op, and I hope you have a wonderful day.